For the 13th, 1984, Berenice Jackson interviewing Edna Barby Davidson and Gladys Barby Howe. Okay, which one of you girls wants to start first? Gladys does.
All right. Father came to Kansas with his father when he was just a small boy, probably 7 years old. The family moved up near Jetmore, Kansas. Then they went back to St. Louis. And then when Father was 16, he came back to work on ranches and worked as herding cattle, things like that, and lived in lion camps by himself as a young boy herding cattle. And he did that for a number of years, and I don't know just what year he started working for the Barby Ranch over south of Protection, Kansas. And he worked there as long as that ranch was in operation. And then he worked at Fred Tender north of Knowles. And that's where he was working when he met our mother, May Beebe. And she and her father and brother and a sister moved to Beaver County in 18, she was 11 years old, she was born in 75.
In 86.
In 86.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived about 15 miles east of Beaver.
Mm-hmm. Did he file then? What was his name?
He was John Beebe.
John Beebe.
He was one of the first commissioners of Beaver County.
Oh, yes.
Pictures in that house.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about
Well, he met Mother then in...
you have to speak a little louder.
A little louder? All right. He met May Beebe in 94. And at that time he was working for Fred Tender. And then they visited back and forth, and I understood that Fred Beebe sold cattle, and they would ship out of Englewood, Kansas. And I remember Father telling a lot of times of the drives to Englewood, Kansas. And they would keep the cattle overnight, herd it out by Englewood, you know, and then ship them out the next day.
What would they do? Drive them to Englewood?
Yes.
Would the two ranchers go together to drive their herd?
No, it would. He was well, at that time, you know, there were no fences.
Yes.
And they herded the cattle. And they'd take several cowboys to drive them. And
approximately how many head would they take at a time?
Well, I know we have a record that I read just recently where they shipped out 400 and some the next morning.
Oh.
And so it'd be large
That would
number,
be,
you know.
Yes.
And they'd call it bedding down the cattle at night. The cowboys get them all in a circle, you know, and then take them into the stockyards. I suppose they had stockyards there at Englewood, and ship them out on the
Is it true they sang to the cattle at night to keep them quiet? I've heard that.
I have too. Yes. Well, I know that, I know they'd say, well, we had to bed the cattle down, and I suppose just see that they got quiet, you know. And
I always wondered if maybe the cowboys sang to keep themselves awake.
Well, I wondered that too.
I think they took turns, you know, through the night. And just had their bedrolls to sleep on.
Yes. Well, they'd have to have a cook wagon, wouldn't they, along with them?
Yes, usually. Usually did. And I suppose that the headquarters down near Knowles
north of
North of
Knowles.
Knowles. And
It's 5 or 6 miles north of the ranch house is still standing on the
Mhm.
old Tinker Ranch.
Oh, is it?
Yes, and he had two parts of his ranch. He had this ranch north of Knowles, and then he had ranch south of Knowles, where Ralph and Marie Barby lived. That was part of the old Tinker Ranch.
Yes.
the one north of Knowles was really the first headquarters.
Yes.
Mhm. Now, was this when your father was working for Tinker?
Yes.
Because
He'd be one of the cowboys then, it was.
Yes,
he
yes,
was.
he was one of the cowboys.
Well, you've heard him tell about those trips then. Mhm.
And then he did that himself after he ranched.
Yes.
That's the way they shipped out. They shipped the cattle.
Well, he probably learned from these
The
ones that he
Yes.
worked for, how to make it.
Before he started working for the Box Ranch, he worked for other people up near Jetmore. What's the name of the town?
Overley, Kansas.
Near Overley.
Yes.
And they drove cattle to Dodge from that area when he was working on those ranches where they drove the cattle to Dodge. And of course, at that time, why they had to keep their cattle, their ranch cattle, together when they drove the herds of cattle from Texas came through to Dodge and going on to the, to Montana when they drove the herds on. Why they had to keep their cattle separated, from the herds from mixing and all.
Yes.
Uh,
Were they ever bothered by Indians at that time when your father was working?
There was one time he told about that he started out from, he wasn't working for the box at that time, I don't believe, but he was over east of Buffalo. And he started out and saw some Indians coming. And he, Father circled back because the other man was still at the camp when he left. And when they got there, all the Indians wanted was food. And they gave them food. And they always thought maybe they were some that had escaped from the cantonment,
Oh.
But they were never bothered.
They didn't molest them.
That's the only time, that instance that I ever remember of Father saying anything about the Indians.
One story Father used to tell was about a dugout over east in the Box Ranch. I think it was in the Box Ranch that when they came to it, they found it was a young man, cowboy, and he was dead. And there was the poem, that "Don't Bury Me Out on the Lone Prairie."
Yes.
Was by the side of him, and that always was rather interesting to me.
Yes.
But the cowboys had to bury him there because they couldn't take him. It was so
I
far.
wonder if he composed that. Was he the one that composed that?
I don't know. I don't know about that. That was always a sad story to me.
Yes.
And Father made the run when the strip opened up. And where he was wanting land was down in the Bartlesville area. Ponca City.
Just west of Ponca
Just
City.
west of Ponca City. And he staked his claim and all, and then he had to leave it, and it was jumped, as they did in those days, So
Yes.
he lost his claim.
Yes.
But Father and Mother were married in '96. And they were married on the Beebe Place out 15 miles east of Beebe.
Yes.
And then
Where did
he what do they call it when they have a claim and somebody
Relinquishment.
he bought a relinquishment
I
from
see.
a man by the name of Red Phillips. and it was just a half a mile from the Beebe home,
Yes.
east.
Mhm.
That is where they...
Well, that made it nice for your mother.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the oldest daughter, May, lives now.
Oh, on the original.
Yes,
the
May.
original.
Yes.
I've never been to May's house, and I've
Yes,
heard
that's
what a
right.
beautiful home she has.
Yes.
I was going to ask you where they started and how did they manage. Evidently, your father just had savings from his
Yes.
monthly
Yes, and
wages.
they first lived west of Clear Lake on Duck Pond for 1 year, and
Yes,
he was still working for Mr. Tanger.
yes,
And then it was after the year was up that he bought this ranch.
I see.
And they started down. And he'd had a few head of steers that he bought along.
And that's
And
that
that
is
was the start.
well. Okay.
And he and mother's brother worked together for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Ran cattle together.
And your mother, I suppose,
They,
did what every other
yes.
wife would do, raise a garden
They lived in a dugout at first,
oh,
and then they moved, what was the hotel in Alpine. He bought this building, and they moved it across the river, and that was their first home. I think that they used the dugout as a kitchen, and this was their living quarters.
So they moved in just a month before Otto, the first son, was born,
But
out of the dugout into these 2 rooms that was the old hotel. The 2 rooms are still part of the home where May lives.
Well, now when we get to it, I want you to describe Alpine for me.
I know so little about it.
Do you remember?
Just what
Now, in the historical book, you know, they have quite a little about...
Yes, but we want it on tape.
Oh, you want it on the
Oh,
tape?
we want it on tape. You mentioned a hotel,
Yes.
a grocery store.
Yes. I think there were 2 saloons and a livery stable.
2
Now, this
saloons.
is all things that have been told. You know.
Well, that's what we have to go on, honey, is what we've been told to see by our fathers
Yes.
and grandfathers.
And it was just
Note all of
across the river south from the Beebe home.
Yes,
in the school. They had a school because
okay.
mother walked to school, which would have been about nearly 3 miles, not quite, probably 2.5 miles. And she had to cross the river.
Mm-hmm.
And men helped grandfather Beebe put rocks in the river, big rocks, and so she could walk across. The river was narrow,
Mm-hmm.
and we always call that the rock crossing. Still to this day, we call it the rock crossing.
Well,
And we could see those rocks for years and years until the big flood.
mm-hmm. How many blocks long would you say that Alpine was?
From just what I can remember of the old rocks that were there from buildings, I wouldn't say more than 3 or 4 blocks, that long.
Okay. Were there any blacksmith shops?
I would think so, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And this hotel you spoke of, how many people could stay there at one time, you think? Do you know anybody that run any of this business, these businesses?
The only person that I know that's still alive that might be able to tell you something is Jimmy Dunlap. But he he might not remember it, but his sisters went to school there with mother.
Oh,
But they're both gone.
he's up in the rest home.
I don't know just what condition, you know.
But now this went on, this was established while your mother and father, no,
It was there before
Before-
they moved.
it was while your grandmother and grandfather, Bibi,
My
was alive.
grandfather, Baby, yes, it was
It
there
was
when
during
they
there.
moved there.
It
Yes.
was, and that would
I tried to find Alpine one day and I never could locate it.
Well,
it's just right by her place.
I live just a half a mile, a quarter of a mile west,
Oh, you do?
and it's to the northeast of me.
Well, we got down and we come to a gate that said private road. And there was a house straight on, I think, east of where that gate was, or not too far from the gate. So we didn't go on.
Where that would have been.
Well, you know where,
The gas companies have put up some of those signs,
Oh, they have.
private roads, see.
so, yes, could have been that. All right, then your grandmother probably did her shopping over there for groceries.
Grandmother died in Medicine Lodge.
Oh,
It was just the grandfather and the 3 children.
I see.
Mother was 11 years old,
Uh-huh.
and the other 2 were older
Yes,
when they came.
I see. Okay, now then, let's go back to your mother and father then, when they were married. And let's see, you said one of the children was born, wasn't it? In this
Yes.
hotel that he
The
moved
first-
down there.
The first son.
And what was his
They were
name?
all born in that.
We were all born in one or the other of these.
Oh, you were?
two
Mom
rooms.
lived downstairs.
Uh-huh.
7 children
Well,
that were born in one or the other of these two rooms.
Mhm.
There were, and there was the upstairs, but
Otto was born there then.
yes.
All right, and when did your father begin to expand and
Well, he
was it
just-
about this time?
They were married in 96, and yes, immediately they
As soon
began
as
to
they
expand.
approved.
And,
Then our Uncle Fred moved away and Father bought that place.
I see.
That was the home, the John Beebe place.
Yes.
Fred had it.
And I suppose that you did a lot of canning and work like that, the women, and what was your chores, Edna, when you got big enough to?
Feeding the chickens, I remember that, gathering the eggs. And our grandfather that we mentioned, Father's father that came to live, he did much of the gardening. That is, Mother I know and Father both helped with the planting and everything. But he did, because I remember that when they would gather the vegetables and everything, and they canned enough for the winter supply of
Yes.
vegetables. And then we'd gather wild plums, you know, and put up lots, I don't know how many quarts of the jelly and butter.
Yes.
And they fixed that outdoors. Had a large iron kettle.
It was a big 50-gallon copper kettle.
Well, I
Oh,
thought it was
it's got
copper
the-
lined iron.
Well, of course it would be, but
And then they came just a large supply at one time, you know. And we had a cellar that we put all the fresh vegetables, you know, that would keep over. And then soon, you know, as soon as they could, they planted orchards. They had 2 large orchards. And so, apples and peaches.
That sounds good, but it meant more work.
Yes, it did. But that's what surprises me today. There were lots of orchards over Beaver County back in those days.
Yes,
Of course,
there
now
were.
they can buy the fruit where they couldn't have bought it back then fresh. I mean,
Yes.
people
And I
came from
suppose-
far around to get fruit from the orchards. Yes.
And peaches, what else besides
and pears and apples.
And
Plums,
cherries.
Yes, and grapes, both on Grandpa Beebe's place and on this place we had grapes.
Wild grapes?
No, the
Grape
grape arbors.
Oh, yes.
The places, both of the places, Grandfather Beebe's place and then where Father and Mother settled, had springs. And they opened up these springs. And our water came from a spring in the house, was piped into the house.
Oh, well, that would be about the first for anybody to have running water in the house, wouldn't it?
Thank goodness.
On Grandpa Beebe's place, they had a spring house, as they called them, and the water ran through. It was a rock house. And the stagecoach from Inglewood to Beaver, that was their noon stop. Where they watered their horses, and this house was a salt stone, and there were hundreds and hundreds of initials carved in those rocks.
Yeah.
And
Are they still there?
well, the rocks have been used.
I see.
And at Father and Mother's place, they had a trough built in one of the rooms that was built. The house was partly in the side of the hill, against the side of the hill, and the water was piped through this trough, and that's where the milk and the butter was kept.
That'd be nice and cool.
Yes, and kept it real nice.
And your drinking water, where did you?
That was our
That was
drinking
your
water.
drinking water too. Well,
And
that was about as pure
Oh, yes,
as you could use.
such good water.
Yes.
And on one of the springs, they built a pond. In fact, it had 4 ponds, I believe it was. But from that pond's where they irrigated the garden.
Yes.
You know.
Well, it sounds like a paradise down there.
When I think back, it seemed like it when I was a little child,
Yes.
really, because they had the trees and it really was nice.
In 1910, I believe it was, that Father had the large barn built. And of course they had so many teams and all the horses, and it had a loft to it, and he put up his hay. There was a big hay meadow, and it had a track and a fork in it that could lift the hay out of the hay racks down below, and he always had that barn full of hay.
Is that barn still standing?
No, that barn burned in 1930, but there was another barn built, but it wasn't used like that with the hay. I don't know that they put hay more than just taking loads of it and putting it in. There's still a big barn there.
Well,
Of course, they got up at daybreak and went to bed after dark, way late, you know.
and it
I
was
know
work
the
for
men, excuse me.
it was work for everybody.
Yes, I always think that the men would get up and go feed the horses, you know, while the horses feeding, then they came for breakfast. I can remember that. So, and I always remember what usually woke me up was Father grinding the coffee.
Oh,
The coffee grinder was
Yes.
right down under the bedroom where I
Yes.
was here.
and that's the
grinding
only
the
kind of coffee you could get.
Yes.
They drove the cattle to Inglewood for years. Of course, it was usually a 2-night out, and they had their chuck wagon, you know, and all the men in their bedrolls, and until in later years after the railroad come into Knowles, why they shipped out of Knowles.
Yes.
And then one period during this early, I can remember real well, so I must have been around 7 or 8 years old. Father bought hogs every Monday or one Monday a month. It was on a Monday.
Oh, yes. So
Was it more than
train.
once a month?
I think twice a month. I think,
And shipped hogs out of Knowles.
Yes.
He bought them at Knowles.
Bought them
Brought them there.
People bring them and shipped hogs out.
Yes.
Did that for several years.
Yes. How many cowboys did it take? Did he keep on an average the year round?
They weren't just, they did all kinds of work. They weren't
Yes.
just cowboys, you know,
Mhm.
for that. And of course he had the brothers, our brothers, they were, from the time
Mhm.
they were just little fellows, that they were out riding just about. And I wouldn't say more than 4 or 5, did you? Always seemed like the table was full.
Well, you see, in our own family,
7 of us.
7 of
Yes.
us, so it always seemed like 10 or 15 at the table.
Our youngest brother, Ralph, spent part of one winter with a cousin of father's that was working for us, for him, over south about 3-4 miles, I'd say, herding cattle, because they put them out on farmers that were around would sell their stocks,
Yes.
and they would herd these cattle out on stocks. And he wasn't but about 9 years old.
Well,
And of course our school terms were very short.
yes.
Usually 3 months at that time was
Well,
about as long as our school terms were.
and you went to the country school.
Yes. There was, it varied. There was one family lived across the river that had a boy, 2 families that had children that came, and then it was children that men worked on the ranch.
Yes.
And their children. But the school never had more than 10 at the most. Imagine.
Where did you go to high school?
Goodwill.
At Goodwill.
Beaver wasn't accredited when my brothers May was ready to go to high school, and they would have had to come to Beaver too, and boarded. And so Goodwill was accredited at that time and had the dormitories, so they started out there. So all of us went to Goodwill and graduated out there, except Edna and Alice graduated in California. Yes, Edna and Alice graduated in California.
Yes. I suppose you all went to college.
I didn't finish.
You didn't finish?
No, I didn't get a degree. I was a dropout.
I guess I was too, married. I went 2 years
But
college.
Others did. All others did.
Otto and Ralph graduated from Stanford University. May from the College of Pacific in California. And Lloyd didn't go to college.
Yes. Well, how come May went to California? Did the family move out there, or?
Well, that's when they graduated from high school. Otto and Ralph and May went out there to go to college.
Oh, I see. The 3 of them went. I thought maybe there was some of your family was
No,
out
no.
there at that time. Okay. Can you think of anything else?
I hate to go way back, but
Well, that's what I want you to do.
was that always interested me with Father was my step-grandmother and 2 girls went back to St. Louis. We said they all went, but they went back, and Father and Grandfather stayed and all that winter then. And then he more or less begged his father to go work on a ranch that time. And then Grandfather went back to St. Louis, and that's when Father started. And at that time they would have people through the winter, maybe just one cowboy, keep cattle, because there weren't fences, and just to watch them. And he herded cattle for a family one winter, and stayed by himself. And said that the only thing he had to read was the dictionary, Webster Dictionary. So that he learned a lot from that.
Father only had a 6th grade education.
Oh, is that right?
But that's what he always said, that the dictionary was his educated.
Yes.
And we spoke about our grandfather, but when the mother and the girls went back to St. Louis, they had been burned out by a prairie fire.
I was going to mention, did you ever have prairie fire out there on your range?
No,
Never did.
They were alone, my grandmother and the two girls and father. And grandfather had gone to some town near there that day when the fire hit. And if it hadn't have been that there was a creek close, my grandmother took the children down and went down the creek, or they would have probably been burned. And so when my grandfather came back and saw everything gone, he thought they had burned too. And he was sitting, because they had a kind of rock wall there, and he was saying, when my father walked up, went back, to tell him, and so the tears were streaming down his face. And he never thought but what he lost everything.
Even his family.
So he had lots to be thankful for,
Yes, he did.
But then that's when they spent that winter there. They had built kind of a dugout in the side of the hill and spent the winter, and then the grandmother and the girls went back to St. Louis.
They'd had it.
They'd had it, yes. Yes. But those prairie fires, we've heard about them this week, haven't we?
Yes.
So we know how terrible they can be.
We're just reading last night the daybook of mothers, and she mentioned in it fires. There's a fire north and a fire south, so they had the fires.
This fire was started from the railroad.
About 10 miles.
There just wasn't much to stop it.
Yes. Well, the wind has been so terrible lately. That's what spread the fires. Let's just. Okay, what was some more of the hazards in the early days that you could think of?
I guess
The blizzards and the floods.
There where your parents lived on this little creek you spoke of, does it really flood badly?
Well,
No.
the little creek we spoke of was our grandfather's.
Oh, yes.
Up in
Yes.
Kansas. But the river used to flood badly, but of course, I suppose it's the Optimal Dam maybe that helps a lot, but it doesn't flood badly.
Well, I think the farming, the terracing, and all that has has helped with
Yes.
the floods, but
I think so.
we've had lots of bad floods.
Mhm.
And of course, Father had the meadow, and in 1923, I think he lost 20-some stacks of hay in
Well,
the flood,
mhm.
fall of 1923. And
The blizzard of 1911 probably wasn't it 1911?
11, 12, the
12.
blizzard they speak of, isn't it
Mhm.
right, or 12 and 13?
11 and 12. Everybody's been telling me
Yeah,
that.
I think that was one of the greatest loss because we lost so many cattle
Mhm.
through that time. Some just, they would drift, as they call it.
Yes.
And some, they lost several in the river.
Mhm.
Mhm. And or would get again after the fences were built. They'd drift against the fence.
Yes. Did your father do any farming at all?
Yes.
What did he raise?
Well, in the early days, imagine it was mostly corn, Capricorn, things like that, because just from things we've been reading lately.
Yes.
But he raised wheat.
Oh, we did.
He had quite a bit of wheat land.
What proportion of his ranch was wheat and pasture?
I don't know what to say, Berenice.
It wouldn't be half and half. No.
They really raised more to feed for the cattle, for the
Yes.
winter, and of course put up hay for the cattle. And it wasn't really until after the First World War, wasn't it, that they started really raising wheat.
Yes.
And of course, the thing with the wheat, they raised for the grazing in the wintertime for the cattle.
Yes. Yes. Well, does John and Ralph's group, do they still raise wheat just like your father did? John
John's
Little?
don't. They have just ranch land.
They just, oh, I
ranch
see.
land.
Well, you
But
have some farming land.
Yes, but it is mostly feed. I lease mine out to Lloyd's
I see.
and pasture land. I have pasture land at least to Marie. And, they still raise wheat and mainly the boys now, they're on the ranch, which are the grandsons,
Yes.
use it for grazing mainly.
And what about you, Edna? Do you have land too?
Yes.
Where does your
mostly
land lay?
Over by Gate.
By Gate?
Yes.
Mhm.
Where we lived was 2 miles west and 2 south of Gate.
Mhm.
And mostly wheat land. Have some pasture.
Yeah.
And I leased my pasture to Lloyd.
Well,
Part of it, she has some farmland up by Knowles too. That
Yes.
was part of the
Yes.
estate.
That was the estate. And then pasture land near Gladys. I have
at the
little pasture.
time of your father's death, how many sections did he own?
Well,
I've heard that he was the biggest rancher in the Beaver County.
At that time, it isn't land that's all together, it's different
Yes.
outline.
Yes,
They said about 40,000 acres.
40,000 acres. How many
Well,
sections? I can't figure that out.
600.
I'd have to have a pencil for that.
I would do. Well, did he proportion it out to each one of the boys to work or oversee certain parts of it or what?
Well, Lloyd had the west part, and that's when they were all
Yes.
living in the ranch, and
Yes.
Otto the central part, and Ralph the east part
Uh-huh.
of the ranch, and it was built for, but they all worked together too.
Sure.
But they had that especially overseeing them
Mhm.
when it came time to handle the cattle, while
Yes.
they all worked
Well, your
together.
father over
The
looked
boys,
the
and then
boys
they
too.
just, they
boys-
always.
The boys and father, they never started a day, they didn't talk things over
Yes.
for what the day's work was to be, They
Mhm.
all consulted together.
They probably all had breakfast together.
No, no. Too many miles.
Too many miles apart.
Yes.
But they had
But
the
they
telephone.
Mm-hmm. Did you have your private telephones?
Well, at one time, we just had their own line. There was no telephone except to Beaver, to Lloyd.
Uh-huh.
And then we just put our own line in, so
Yes.
there wasn't any telephone in that area. So they just, sometimes we felt like we was hollering. They could hear us hollering to make them hear.
The
It
line
wasn't
was-
always a good line, but yet it served the purpose.
Yes.
The first part of it was just on the fence, fence
Uh-huh.
post down. And, well, of course, Father had the phone from Beaver and part of the time from Mills.
In the early days, earlier,
Mm-hmm.
why, when Father and lived on the home place,
Mm-hmm.
which we call headquarters,
Mm-hmm.
why there was the phone line as we grew up out of Knowles.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Then that line all went out. I don't know why. I just don't remember that. But then when Lloyd moved to the Frank Maple place, was on the West End, why they had the phone line from Beaver. And then, of course, if we wanted messages to Beaver, Lloyd relayed them for us. And but now, of course, we have RTA, and that's
Yes.
a wonderful help.
Yes, it certainly is. It seemed to me like I heard when we were working on the Beaver County history books that you had a central store, too, on the ranch. Was that was just rumor?
It really wasn't a store, but, probably from the very beginning, Mother and Father ordered groceries, from Sears Roebuck, I think.
From the-
Once or twice a year, they'd order enough of the staples,
Yes.
And then they'd have them delivered at headquarters, and we called it
Yes.
headquarters where Father lived back
That came
later.
by freight to Knowles,
The
from
early
Sears,
day,
Oh,
yes,
mhm.
yes, and they'd bring it. Then in the early days, Father, later, after they quit getting it from Sears and ordered it that way, they would usually about, every 3 months or something,
Twice a year.
twice
I
a
made
year.
out my grocery,
Yes,
what I
And-
needed. It wasn't until after we had Ideal Food Stores at Liberal that they did this. Now, that's where probably you got the story.
and they would,
They would bring them to headquarters, and then we'd
Each go on, yes.
each family
good.
would make out what they would need for the 6 months,
And you
before
buy
they had-
sugar by the 100 pounds,
Yes,
or?
flour
and
by the
flour.
50 pounds.
Uh-huh.
And we'd know just about how much it would take for that length of time. We did it twice a year.
Well, that's what it was then. I'd forgotten.
when we were children, when they ordered from Sears, they'd order 2 or 3 as the large box, like oranges used to come
Yes,
in, the
yes.
crates of cookies they'd get. I remember ginger snaps. And, of course, Mother, they did lots of baking. Their baking was usually on Saturday.
Yes. I remember May telling that when her parents was going to be gone, they'd never lock the door. And they would put food out for people that might be passing through. Is that right? I think May was one told me.
Is that right? Well, she would remember that
She
more
would
than
remember.
I would.
We, people traveled through that in those days, stopped for a meal,
Yes.
you never knew
You
how
never-
many you were going to have or anything, and they didn't
Last
have to
night,
be invited in.
last night, one of these day books, as we call them, of mothers, we were reading in, and it mentioned that 2 strangers had stayed all night.
Oh, while they were gone.
No, they were there.
Oh, they
but
were
see,
there.
They lived the night.
Had
But
a-
at one time, mother fed the people on the stagecoach.
Oh,
It stopped over at there,
yes.
and she fed them. I don't know how long this was, but I can remember the stagecoach stopping.
And did they change horses there?
I think they did at Grandpa Beavy's at one
Yes, I
time.
guess they did.
They came from Inglewood,
Mhm.
two Beavers, see, and came through
And then they
there.
would go back probably
Through, yes.
and change horses again.
That's the way I understood that they did.
What was the name of that stage line?
No, I don't think I
Or
ever
did it
heard.
have
I
a
don't
name?
I
know
don't
that
know
it
that
had
it
a
did,
name.
no.
Mm.
You can still see the tracks
Oh, you
At
can.
places.
at places out east of, well, it's south of where Lloyd lives, on the
Yes.
hills there. You can see the ruts of those.
Well, now let's see, let's get back to the birth of the children. We just talked about Otto being born. I want you to name the rest of them anyway,
Oh.
if you don't mind.
Otto.
Otto was the first. Who was the next?
Lloyd, Ralph, May.
No, May, right.
Didn't make a mistake.
Okay.
Shall I start over?
Okay, start over.
Otto, Lloyd, May, Ralph, Gladys, myself, and our sister Alice.
Uh-huh.
And then you see that there was our half-brother Boardman and half-sister Doris Carroll.
Mother
Oh.
died in 1918, and father remarried in
And who did your father marry?
Helen Hughes.
And they had Boardman, and
Doris Carroll.
what happened to Doris
Doris
Carroll?
Carroll died in 1930.
30.
And where's Boardman?
35. Boardman lives in Woodward.
Oh, he does.
June Barby, I expect is what he's listed under.
Gee.
He's a
Okay.
geologist.
Can you think of anything else that's important for us to record?
Sure, there've been lots of things we
I would
should
like for you
have.
to list the children of each one of you, if you, do we have time?
Yes. Give me
Okay,
10
let's
minutes.
go. 10 minutes. Okay.
Otto had
Otto's children,
Carlton and Leland.
and he married
Anna Hughes.
Hughes. And
Lloyd had married Margaret Reed and had two children, Benita and Lloyd Reed. Lloyd Reed was his name. And then Margaret passed away, and later he married Celestine Pearson. And they had Marion, Norma Jean, and Stanley.
Okay.
May married John Little, and they had the one daughter, Janine Little. Janine Carnes, she was.
Yes.
And then Ralph married Marie Pearson. She and Westy were sisters.
Yes.
And they had Beverly and Carla May and Stuart.
And
Beverly
Stuart is
Miners.
gone and
Stuart and Carla May both are deceased.
deceased.
And we didn't mention that Carlton
Was deceased.
Oh, yes.
And then I married Burl Howe, and we had Roy Lou and Lena May and Barbie. And Barbie's deceased.
So you still have a son and a daughter?
Daughter.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay.
And then Alice married Guy Bean, and she passed away in 1954, and she had no
She
children.
had no children.
And Borden married Sandra McCormick,
Yes.
and they have Brant and Greg and Brad and Lisa. And Doris Carroll, of course, died as a young girl.
Yes.
I don't think I mentioned that I married Arnold Davidson.
Oh, you did?
I'm not going to be left out.
And we did leave you out. Okay, we'll let you tell us now.
Okay. And I have two daughters, Mary and Myrna D.
Well, that sounds like you've had a wonderful life and And a wonderful family.
We started
Love
out,
our family.
have always been a close family and still are, even for third and fourth cousins we all get together yet. Our family's grown quite a bit this summer.
Yes.
We try to get together every other Christmas and have a picnic every summer now for the last,
Well, that's
8,
wonderful.
I guess.
That family togetherness is, it means so much to you.
It surely does.
Mhm. Well, I thank you girls for coming. I've enjoyed this.
I hope
and-
this is what you can get something out of it.
Well, I'm sure that it's been good. Anyway, I've enjoyed it, and people who
Thank you.
listens to this, I'm sure will enjoy it too, and I sure thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.